Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you. Welcome to today's webinar. Today's webinar is about human rights and impact assessment. My name is Tanya Frazier, and I will be your moderator for today's presentation. The webinar today is hosted by the International Association of Impact Assessment, or IAIA. We are the leading global network for best practice in using impact assessment to make informed decisions. PowerPoint does not want to shift. There it is. All right. Today's webinar is part of a series of webinars that are offered by IAIA, and you'll be able to see many of those other webinar options if you go to IAIA.org, find the training link under resources, and then you'll be able to see an archive of all of the webinars that we have offered since the beginning of our webinar series in, I believe, 2016. Some of the recent webinars or webinars that have had high watch numbers include a webinar on ESG, a webinar regarding enforcement and compliance, grievance mechanisms, and a basic primer on understanding impact assessment. You will also see on the website an increasing number of online training options. One of them is our online training and mentorship program called the PDP, or Professional Development Program. That course just started yesterday or on Monday for wherever you are. We'll have another course starting this summer in June and another starting in September. So check out the information about that if you'd like to be on an alert list for when those courses become available. Please send an email to the address that is connected. We have some big events coming up. Our annual conference is going to be held in true COVID form in an online fashion this year. So IAI 21 will be fully online. Registration details are available on the website. And as the weeks progress, you'll see more and more information regarding presenters and topics and additional details. So we as a team are very excited about bringing you this conference in a top-notch fashion. You will also see over the next month to 2 months that there's going to be a new series of online training courses that are going to be happening, similar to the training courses that you have been able to access at the beginning of a conference. We are now going to be bringing those to you at home over a series of days, a couple of weeks for some of the settings, and you're going to be able to access as many of them as you would like. That suit your interests. So be watching the e-news for those announcements, as well as we will be giving a listing of what current courses are open, as well as what courses are to come. Finally, the IAI website is just full of downloadable publications like best practices and fast tips, and it's just a wealth of knowledge. So if you haven't played at the IAI website recently, please take some time to go explore. Finally, we have just a couple of housekeeping details. One question that we are always asked is this recording being, or is this presentation being recorded? Yes, indeed, the presentation is being recorded. It will be made available within 48 hours. You will automatically get a email with the link to this recording, as well as to the handouts that are associated with it. This particular webinar is in a Q&A panel fashion, and so there will not be slides to follow during the presentation. The only slides are these housekeeping slides, which we don't really need to offer for printing, because I don't think they're that much of a treasure to most of you. Also, if you have questions during the presentation today, there is a question section. If you look in the control panel on the right of your screen, there is a place to be asking questions. Those questions will come directly to me. If you have questions about logistical things, feel free to ask them there. If you have questions that you'd like to pose to the presenters, feel free to post them there as well. And you're able to post them in real time. You don't have to wait until we get to the Q&A section to start unloading questions. So as they're speaking, if something comes up to you, go ahead and add it to the question panel. I would love to say that we're going to be able to reach all of our questions, but to be honest, we had over 1,150 registrants for this webinar, and 466 are currently in this space, so we're not going to be able to get to all questions, but we will do our best to hit as many conceptual question topics as we can. Last but certainly not least, if you look in your control panel, you'll also see a panel bar that says Handouts. This particular panel team has put together a stellar lineup of 4 different handouts that are available for you. You can print them out and look at them as they're referring to them during the presentation, or you're able to fill them out following, or print them out following for your resources. They are also going to be available when the link to the recording is posted. So the only other announcement that I would give, just in case I forget to share it later, is there will be a survey at the end of the presentation. And I invite you to take just a couple of minutes as you're logging off of the webinar, fill out those questions. They help us immensely, and the presenters have put some really thoughtful time into choosing some additional questions they'd like to know from you in developing further presentations that they do as a team. So, without any further ado, I am going to shift my microphone and camera and screen off and introduce to you our facilitator of this particular panel. This panel is going to be facilitated by Talika Bansal. Talika is a senior advisor for the Danish Institute on Human Rights, and she has over 13 years experience in the field of human rights and business, and has conducted, led, or contributed to nearly 20 human rights impact assessments in various regions and across industries. She has also contributed to the development of various HRIA tools and methodologies. So with that, I'm going to pass the virtual microphone over to Talika.
Thank you, Tanya, for this kind introduction. So I will be facilitating this session, and first I'll speak a little bit about what an HRA is, and then we have set up a panel of 3 speakers, and we look forward then after that hearing from you and getting some questions. So first of all, I wanted to mention that this webinar focuses on human rights impact assessment in relation to private sector projects. We saw that some questions came in related to public sector projects or programs, but the focus is really on private sector projects. So let me start what an HRIA or human rights impact assessment is. This is a relatively new methodology for companies to understand what their human rights impacts are. This approach has been applied longer for example, government policies and programs, but in the private sector context, it's more recent. So what is it? It is a methodology that allows to assess and understand and address the adverse effects of a business project or activity or operation on the human rights enjoyment of impacted rights holders. And with rights holders, we mean those that could be adversely impacted, such as workers, community members, or consumers. We say that human rights impact assessments are assessments on human rights. So we use human rights as our benchmark for an assessment. We do it through human rights. So human rights impact assessment should be carried out through a human rights-based approach. And they are for human rights. So an impact assessment that aims to improve the human rights situation of those persons that could be potentially or actually affected. There are a lot of different types of human rights impact assessments. The first being company-led human rights impact assessments, which are assessments commissioned by a company and carried out by an independent third party that look at a specific project or a product or a value chain or an operation in a certain country. This could, for example, be looking at a raw material supply chain like coffee or cocoa or palm oil. It could be looking at the impacts of an oil pipeline or a mine. Then The second type of assessment is impact assessments where human rights are integrated. So we can think of integration of human rights in an environmental or social impact assessment that is required by law in certain countries. A third type of impact assessment is the community-based human rights impact assessment. This is a methodology that was developed by the organization Rights and Democracy and is currently being applied by different NGOs such as Oxfam and FIDH. And the aim of such an assessment is to assess the adverse impacts of a project on a community, and they then use such an assessment as an advocacy tool. And the fourth type of assessment that exists is the so-called sector-wide impact assessment, which looks at an entire industry or sector in a country rather than at one project. So these are the different types of assessments that exist, and our panelists will be elaborating a little bit more on the different types of impact assessments and the challenges and opportunities related to this. So let me introduce our panelists. Please turn on your cameras. So we have three panelists with us. We'll kick off with Dirk Hofman, who is a senior advisor at the Danish Institute for Human Rights and has 11 years of experience working with and advising multinational companies in various sectors and geographies, including organizing and conducting human rights impact assessments. We're also honored to have with us Gabriella Factor, who is an environmental and social specialist with more than 20 years of experience in environmental and social impact assessment, human rights impact assessment, and due diligence worldwide. She has worked on the integration of gender and human rights in policies, programs, assessment tools, and methodologies, and has provided several trainings and courses on these topics. And last but not least, we have among us Nora Butzman, who is Chief Advisor at the Danish Institute for Human Rights and has 13 years of experience working in business and human rights. She has conducted site-level human rights impact assessment, but has also developed the human rights impact assessment guidance and toolbox, and developed and delivered a masterclass for practitioners on integrating human rights into impact assessment. And more recently, she was the editor of the first ever handbook on human rights impact assessment that she will talk about a little bit more later on. So with this, I would like to ask Dirk some questions to start with. So Dirk, could you give us a brief introduction to what human rights are and what the UN guiding principles on business and human rights are, and how human rights impact assessment fits into these principles? Thank you.
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm really glad to be here. Yeah, let me start a little bit basic, since not everyone may have a human rights background in our very large audience. So human rights are universal legal guarantees that are protecting individuals and groups, basically against actions which interfere with these fundamental freedoms. And the most important document that many of you may have heard about is the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And then there are also two covenants which are covering civil and political rights. So for example, freedom from torture or freedom of speech, the right to vote, and others. And then there's another covenant on social and economic rights, like the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to food, right to water, right to housing, right to health. And these are international treaties, and these naturally only bind states who sign up to these treaties and then ratify them into their own national legislation. And through this national legislation, they can then bind individuals in the states as well. But as markets and supply chains became increasingly global and complex after the Second World War, there were a lot of questions about the line of responsibility for human rights violations in a business context. So for example, is it the fault of a business for paying workers less than a living wage? Or is it actually the state's fault for setting the minimum wage laws in the country too low? And in 2011, I'm obviously shortening history here very much. And in 2011, the UN elaborated some guiding principles on business and human rights that try to address exactly this question, where the line of responsibility between states and businesses actually lies. So these guiding principles are structured alongside 3 pillars. And the first pillar very much talks about the responsibility of the state in terms of protecting, but also, of course, respecting themselves, human rights, but also protecting against abuses by third parties, including businesses. And the second pillar then talks specifically about the responsibilities of businesses to respect human rights, meaning to not negatively impact human rights. And the third and last pillar is then about what happens if something goes wrong, so access to remedy for victims of potential human rights abuses. But let me just say a few words about the second pillar, which talks about what companies are supposed to do to ensure that they are not negatively impacting human rights. They are supposed to conduct human rights due diligence. This means a number of things. It starts out very basic by the company having to commit itself to respecting human rights through, for example, a human rights policy. Then the company should assess which actual or potential human rights impacts are connected to the business operations. They should address these risks through mitigation measures, and they should monitor the effectiveness of these mitigation measures on an ongoing basis. And finally, they should communicate about how they are, what are their risks, and how are they addressing these risks. So, from an human rights impact assessment perspective, the most important element here is, of course, the phase about assessing your actual and potential human rights impacts, which is where a human rights impact assessment would sit. One key thing to mention here would be that the UN Guiding Principles do not require specifically a human rights impact assessment. They just require an assessment of human rights risks and impacts, which can be done through a variety of different types of assessments.
Thank you, Dirk. So you mentioned that companies can use different methods to assess their risks and impacts, and this often causes confusion. So could you briefly mention what the difference is between a human rights risk assessment, human rights impact assessment, and a social audit?
Yeah, that's very true. The businesses are using quite a lot of different terminology when they're talking about how they are assessing their risks or their impacts. Human rights risk assessments can sometimes mean, for example, just desktop-based research. They can also mean, being part of a certification scheme, or they mean conducting audits that sometimes integrate human rights. Also integrating human rights into other types of assessments like social impact assessments or environmental impact assessments. I think a lot of people in the audience will probably be familiar with audits, which are a very prominent way of conducting risk assessments nowadays, because they are usually time and cost-effective way of doing so. But they have come under frequent criticism for a number of shortcomings, specifically that they often only look at the first tier of a supply chain, so only at the direct business relationships that businesses have. Auditors often don't have sufficient human rights expertise to adequately consider these impacts as well, and they only spend a very short amount of time on site. The methodology and how they conduct these assessments also has come under criticism for, usually asking, closed questions, yes/no questions, which may lead to actually missing some of the human rights that may be impacted. And another criticism has been that it often doesn't consider impacts on communities, but actually only looks at at workers and not at other kind of rights holders that may be impacted.
Thank you, Dirk. And following up on this, you mentioned some of the shortcomings of social audits, but what would a good quality human rights impact assessment then look like, given that there is no definition based on your experience and expertise working on this? What would you say are some of the things we should consider as a good quality HRA?
Yeah, so as you already mentioned, Tulika, there is no universally agreed standard on what a good human rights impact assessment looks like. The Danish Institute has been working with other practitioners, in the last decade on coming up with kind of an agreed standard or principles for what a good human rights impact assessment would look like. And we'll share this also with you towards the end of the session and show you the Human Rights Impact Assessment Toolbox that we have developed, which is freely available for anyone to check. And in that toolbox, we have defined 10 criteria for human rights impact assessments, which can help in answering this question. I'm not going to go through all of the 10 criteria because that would go beyond the time that we have, but just to pull out two important ones. One key element of human rights impact assessment is stakeholder engagement. And that means, on the one hand, identifying the rights holders and their entitlements, also identifying respective duty bearers and their obligations in the planning phase of such an assessment. And most importantly, it means engaging these stakeholders during the assessment or engaging with organizations that represent these stakeholders during the actual field assessment. A good HRIA also looks at all relevant, actual, and potential impacts, not just in your own company's operations, but also in your business relationships. So, for example, your suppliers and your contractors or your joint venture partners. And this is also a key point highlighted by the UN Guiding Principles, that businesses should go beyond their own operations and consider impacts in their supply chain.
Thank you so much, Dirk. I'll now hand over to Gabriella, she will talk more about integration of human rights into other strands of impact assessment. So my first question to you is, based on your experience, could you share what the main differences are between a social impact assessment and a human rights impact assessment?
Thank you, Tulika. And I'm going to answer this from my own experience and doing both social impact assessment and human rights impact assessment. One of the main differences, it is the timing in the projects. Most of the social impact assessments happened before the project takes place, while most of the human rights impact assessment normally commissioning in ongoing projects. This is not black and white. Luckily, there is an increasing trend of human rights being conducted before in order to prevent or avoid it. But in today's practice is a question of timing. The other big difference is the way that the issues of labor are covered. A human rights impact assessment has a much more focus and a lot of detail in the way that labor issues and potential impacts are addressed, that we don't have so much in social impact assessment. We concentrate on how many jobs, which type of jobs, can these jobs go to the local community, or where is the workforce coming from? While human rights impact assessment goes much more in detail about the labor conditions and the fulfillment of the international labor conventions for the workers. And this being said, the focus on the suppliers and the supply chain is much greater as well in human rights than it is in social impact assessment. Then for me, I think the biggest learning for me as an impact assessment practitioner from human rights is that much more focus on equality and discrimination. And that forces us to make different questions. For example, in social impact assessment, you will ask like, who's benefiting? Who's impacted and who's benefiting? But then if you focus on equality and discrimination, then the questions start to be who is not benefiting and why. And that requires also a bigger level of disaggregation in the data for gender, for ethnic groups, or for different groups in society in order to unpack these questions on equality and discrimination. And that means also that you have a baseline that is much more detailed and which is using human rights as a benchmark instead of before and after the project. And then the other big difference is that we move from the stakeholders in human rights to the right holders and the duty bearers. And that differentiation actually has a lot of implications because we start to look at which are the entitlements of the impacted workers and the communities. And more importantly, which are the capacities and responsibilities of duty bearers. And we really unpack and go in detail into that in human rights impact assessment, which has a lot of there has a lot of implication, for example, in the management plan. Who's going to be responsible, and do they have the capacity, and are they entitled to take that responsibility?
Thank you, Gabby. My second question to you is, what would you see as the advantages and disadvantages of conducting a standalone human rights impact assessment or taking an integrated approach where we integrate human rights into other strands of impact assessment?
So if we take the integrated approach, I think there are a lot of positive sides of that. One of them is that there is more dialogue and more interaction with different specialists, with ecosystem services, with health specialists, with much more dialogue with the technical teams. And that gives the assessment and the recommendation more precise and more concrete and very practical. There is also, because of you have this dialogue, it's more likely that the recommendations are going to be implemented because there is only one management plan and not several management plans that may, within the project or organization, has a problem of who implemented what, and do we have resources, and can we implement all of them or not. And I think that having these professionals and the technical teams talking together improves the awareness, the practice, and the performance of human rights at all levels of the company, which I find that is a big advantage. And then it could be it is also more cost effective. And in terms of, it's better to have only one well-planned consultation with affected workers and communities than having several groups going, causing maybe a consultation fatigue among the people that the affected communities and workers. But there's also a downside. We may risk that we have to compromise the quality of some of them, because then normally the fact that we have an integrated doesn't mean that we have a much bigger budget or longer time. And normally the human rights impact assessment, they are more generous on the time because they recognize the need of a very in-depth engagement that sometimes the social and environmental impact assessment don't have. So there is a risk of this compromising quality and depth of the human rights impact assessment when you have it. And then there is sometimes you can find this confusion or concerns or sensitivities regarding human rights in when you have to publish or how to conduct it, etc. And in certain contexts, the communities and individuals may be at risk if some information enter the public domain. And I had this experience one that I was working at due diligence and reviewing the impact assessment, and the recommendation for the client was to do a standalone parallel human rights impact assessment, because it was for me doubt whether the FPIC will be triggered or not. And then there was a background of discrimination and persecution to indigenous leaders and community leaders. So you were risking that maybe you will, in your security arrangement, you will have some people that have previously conflict, etc. And because the team that was working on that was not used to work with human rights, suddenly start to circulate some information about people that were opposing the project with name and last name and address, and things that will never happen because it will put this in that context. That was a high risk. But because the team was not used to deal with these sensitive issues, so that created a certain tension there. So if we go to standalone impact assessment, probably the biggest advantage is that that you will have the right competences on place. It will not probably one human rights expert, but you could have all the expertise in human rights that you need. And then, so you have dedicated focus on expertise. Then you can better focus on the vulnerable groups or the groups that are discriminated or the communities that are more sensitive. So immediately you will have the focus that you want. You will have more freedom to the company to identify and address human rights issues. Doesn't matter in which country context that you are. And I think that many times what I see as a very good combination is that you have an official, regular social impact assessment or environmental and social impact assessment, but you can have a standalone in order to inform or to complement certain topics or aspects of that. The downside of the standalone impact assessment is that they may exacerbate some political sensitivities. There are some countries where you just cannot openly say that you're doing or publish or highlight some human rights issues. And sometimes you can get less buy-in from the internal stakeholders in the company or projects to implement it. That when it is human rights, but you don't call it human rights, talk about environmental, and so it's easy maybe to make sure that they get implemented as you want it.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. So now I'll turn over to our last panelist, Nora. And my first question to you is, based on your experience in conducting human rights impact assessment, but also doing extensive research on this topic, what do you see as some of the main challenges related to human rights impact assessment?
Thanks, Tulika. And yeah, just thrilled to be with you all here today and that there is so much interest in this topic. It's just a delight that people can attend one more webinar. We realize there have been a lot of them, so it's a real pleasure to be here. Tulika, if you'll allow me, perhaps I could answer the question thinking through some of the challenges, but also the opportunities at the same time, if that's okay. Because thinking through that this question might arise, what I did is turn back to the handbook that Tulika mentioned that some of us have been involved in, and revisited the conclusion in that handbook where we really looked to summarize from all the contributions, what are some of the key kind of themes and emerging topics in human rights impact assessment? What is, the state of the art of human rights impact assessment practice at the moment, and what are the ways forward? And we collectively identified 10 key kind of themes or patterns or trends. And what I wanted to share with you today is just some brief reflections on 3 of those themes, because we don't have time to go through all of them. And those 3 themes really center around rights holder engagement, then some reflections around the interaction between the project level and the governance sphere, and lastly, some thoughts around transparency and accountability, all of which are topics that Dirk and Gabby have already touched on as well. So really one of the key things in human rights impact assessment, as has been mentioned, or from a human rights perspective, if we're integrating human rights in other types of assessments, is that we need to ensure that rights holders are really at the center of this process throughout the impact assessment, through meaningful participation and a disaggregated analysis. And here, some challenges that we see are some challenges that arise through practice. For example, limited time and skills on behalf of an impact assessment team, limited resources, but also accessibility of rights holders to the process, or indeed the assessments team accessibility to rights holders. And that can arise in different industry contexts in different ways. It might be, physical remoteness. It might be in a conflict situation that it's challenging to talk to specific groups because it might cause risks for them, as Gabby just elaborated. There can be a range of different reasons. But I think we also have some opportunities here because particularly company commissioned assessment can really learn from some of the specific methodologies and tools and approaches that have been applied in more community-based approaches. So that could be, for instance, community-based impact assessment approaches, such as the one that Oxfam is heavily involved in, that Tulika mentioned. It can also have involve thinking about the governance structure for an assessment. For instance, do we have a multi-stakeholder steering group in place for an assessment? That's also a way to think about increasing participation in the impact assessment. Another challenge here is, as Gabby mentioned, around a deeper level of analysis of how are different groups or individuals affected. So really this focus on non-discrimination and on disaggregation. And often what we see still in environmental and social impact assessment, but also human rights impact assessments, ironically actually, is that we remain within this framing of vulnerable groups, that we, come with a sort of predetermined idea that, for instance, children will be vulnerable, women will be vulnerable, indigenous peoples will be vulnerable, and that we think about the issues faced by these particular groups through more of a single issues analysis. So when we talk about children, we think about child labor. When we talk about women, we think about sexual and gender-based violence. Now, that's not to say that, of course, any of those things can arise and indeed be the most relevant thing to consider in a particular context. But the point is that perhaps we should come with a more open perspective to really consider what are the situations for those different individuals and how are they impacted, what makes them vulnerable in a certain situation, and when are they perhaps not vulnerable, and also what are their particular human rights, of course. So going back to the introduction that Dirk alluded to, that there are, of course, specific rights held by these different rights holders that we would also want to take account for. So here the opportunities then are to utilize more specialized expertise, for example, bringing on board women's rights specialists, integrating disaggregate analysis throughout an assessment. So rather than having a standalone section perhaps on gender impacts, to rather integrate that throughout the whole assessment, so that under each issue that the impact assessment addresses, we consider what are the different impacts on women, what are the different impacts on men, on girls, on boys, or on LGBTI persons, for instance, and then how can they be addressed. And to further integrate the knowledge of rights holders themselves. So the human rights-based approach that Tuulika mentioned, of course, comes with the sort of understanding that those that are impacted have a vast knowledge about what those impacts mean for them in their everyday lives. So it's more about finding out from rights holders themselves, actually, how do they experience those impacts and what are their suggestions for how those impacts might be best avoided or mitigated. The second area that I wanted to touch on is the linkage between the project level and the wider governance sphere. And I think this is particularly critical right now in a situation where we have a global pandemic that has brought to the fore more than ever some of the issues that we know are associated with certain business model structures, for instance. So corporations that have a large supply chain that stretches across the whole world, and all the different types of impacts on rights holders that we know are involved in that type of business model. So I think we need to think a bit as an impact assessment community around what can a project level assessment do, whether that's a project level social impact assessment, environmental impact assessment, human rights impact assessment, and how does that relate to the governance sphere? For instance, how does that relate to how a certain industry is regulated, to regional planning about how land rights are governed in a particular area, etc. Because there are certainly things that a project level assessment can do. It can get very close to the issues in a particular area, but there are also certain things that it cannot do. It often does not address, what are some of the root causes that arise in a particular industry, for instance, that arise in a particular business model, or it cannot, for example, sufficiently take account of, how do we govern, for instance, land use associated with this industry in a whole country. So here, some opportunities arising, I think, very much rest in one of the assessment methodologies that Tuulika mentioned, which is a sector-wide impact assessment, which looks at an industry or a sector as a whole in a country, both at project level impacts, at cumulative impacts, and also at the regulatory space, to try to paint a more holistic picture of how human rights impacts associated with that sector might be addressed. We can also think about drawing from company commissioned assessments to feed some of that learning into, for instance, corporate governance frameworks or industry level guidance. And we can also utilize, for instance, findings that have come from a sector-wide impact assessment you know, to inform early country entry decisions of companies, or to think about what are the primary human rights issues that a particular company or project might need to address as they seek to establish a particular project. So this is not, you know, a sort of conclusive or definitive, this is, you know, what we need to do, or where we need to go. I think there is clearly a need for both, for sector level analysis, for governance approaches, and also for project level assessments. But I think the opportunity is in seeing the greater connections between those two and how they can mutually support each other, with a view to also meeting the 2030 agenda. So that was the second sort of area that I wanted to touch on. The last area that I wanted to briefly mention is transparency and accountability. And Gabby, you've already given us a very good lead in here to some of the challenges that might be associated with transparency and accountability. So perhaps just to build on some of those remarks that you already introduced. So essentially, I think from a human rights impact assessment perspective, there is a challenge around company commissioned assessments that we frequently still see companies announcing that they're doing, you know, human rights impact assessments, but they are nowhere to be found accessible to the public. And that does really create an accountability gap and an accountability issue. Both on a very practical level for rights holders that have been involved in those assessments, and also from a more philosophical or normative level, if you like. So, of course, with all the provisos in mind that Gabby already flagged around privacy and the need to ensure that rights holders are not adversely affected by the publication of any specific information, there is very much a push towards publication of assessments so that we can all access those and hold companies accountable for indeed then addressing the impacts that have been identified there. And in terms of accountability, perhaps to link back again to some of the points that Dirk touched on when we think about, well, do we have a common understanding of what is a good practice human rights impact assessment? You know, what is the gold standard, for example, that we can compare against to say, well, we're satisfied with this particular assessment and we're not satisfied with this particular assessment. And there, I think, although there has been significant work done by the Danish Institute, but also by a number of other actors, perhaps there is a role for an association like IAIA or other international organizations to think collectively through, do we want to, you know, define a little bit more what actually those criteria should be, that we can hold each other accountable to then those particular standards or principles that we've collectively identified as essential for human rights impact assessment. And there is also an opportunity in terms of accountability to think more around, well, how can requirements for human rights impact assessment, be that a standalone assessment or an integrated one, but the point being the analysis of human rights impacts for projects. What are perhaps some frameworks that could ensure that companies are actually required to undertake this type of analysis? So here we can think about impact assessment legislation. Should that require, for example, a focus on human rights? We can think about industry standards, we can think about financial institutions' performance standards, and we can also think about developing legislation or regulation, for example, mandatory human rights due diligence legislation. That is a big discussion in the business and human rights community at the moment. So to think through who might be the actors that are responsible also for developing some of these standards and frameworks where we can ensure that human rights, if integrated, would then have a much larger role to play in impact assessment as a whole. So I'll leave it at that so that we also have some time for questions.
Thank you so much, Nora, and thank you to all three panelists for this rich discussion. And before we go to the Q&A, I want to give a few minutes to Dirk. We had promised to share some tools and resources, so Dirk will very briefly walk us through the Danish Institute's Human Rights Impact Assessment Guidance and Toolbox.
Yes, I will do that. Let me just share my my screen. So yeah, in the materials or the handouts, you will also find a 2-page overview to this human rights impact assessment guidance and toolbox that you now see here on the screen. As I mentioned before, it's freely accessible, and it's a resource that is supposed to help you through all of the phases of a human rights impact assessment. And it's targeted towards practitioners, but also towards companies who are thinking about planning an assessment or creating terms of references for an assessment. And in that regard, we have structured it alongside different phases. This is the starting page that you see here. Each phase also has a short introduction video that summarizes what's going on in this phase. And then each phase we also have practical guidance, or like that is editable, or that can be used for practitioners that are involved in an impact assessment. We have different entry points that you can see here on the side that also link to your level of knowledge about human rights impact assessments. So if you are new, or if you are interested in how to integrate human rights impact assessments into other types of assessments like environmental, social, or health impact assessments, you'll find some quick links on the side here. And then we have basically the different phases here. I should probably mention that it's available in English, in French, and in Spanish at this point in time. So here you can see we have an introduction video, a short summary of the phase, but then you can also access the full phase that you're interested in. These are the practitioner supplements, which I just mentioned. For example, in the first phase of planning an HRIA, or the scoping phase as we call it, there's a supplement that helps you create terms of references for an HRIA, or doing the scoping for the HRIA. So you have overall 5 phases that of the HRA, and also a cross-cutting section on stakeholder engagement. We also have collected some case studies for each phase, where practitioners, including company representatives, are talking about their experiences in relation to this particular phase. So, for example, in relation to scoping and impact assessment. And we have a collection of resources that are, also pulling in what other experienced practitioners or institutions have put out. We're trying to continuously, update this also with videos or master classes or other type of kind of resources that people interested in impact assessment would like to have access to. Let me see if there's anything else that I would want to mention here. I think, in short, that is it. I can highly recommend that you check it out. It has something for every level of experience. I think it is hopefully will help you in integrating or having a standalone impact assessment in the future.
Thanks so much for this, Dirk. And then I wanted to give you the word again, Nora. You recently edited the first ever handbook on human rights impact assessment. Could you tell us a little bit more about the handbook and how we can get hold of the handbook?
Yes, very, very happy to do that. So there's a brief overview in one of the handouts that you can access as part of the webinar. So there's more information about how you can access the handbook there. But it's available on Edward Elgar, both in hard copy and also in a soft copy version. And it looks something like this. So I'll just hold it up briefly here. Just quickly, a couple of words about it. So this is part of a series, an Edward Elgar handbook series focusing specifically on impact assessment, which is edited by Frank Langley. And this particular volume focuses on human rights impact assessment in the context of business and human rights. So exactly the topic that we're discussing here today. It's looking to take an inclusive definition of human rights impact assessment. So there are chapters on company commissioned assessments, on the sector-wide impact methodology that we've been talking about, on community-based approaches, and also on other innovative new approaches that seek to combine some of these different perspectives. It has 27 chapters, so it is rather comprehensive, and hopefully there is something in there for everyone. We have 35 contributors, and I'd like to note there that it is interdisciplinary, and it seeks to also share some different perspectives from different global regions. So we have practitioners and academics from all around the world that have contributed to the volume. And the target audience includes practitioners, researchers, businesses. It can also be relevant for investors, government actors, civil society, or multilateral institutions. So really anybody who is involved from, very practically, I have to commission a company assessment here for a particular operation, or I have to review one or develop a terms of reference for one, to, government regulators that are thinking through, well, how do we integrate human rights in regulation for impact assessments, for instance. It has a couple of different sections, so perhaps worth mentioning that after the introductory section, which just gives an overview of the different types of methodologies, we have some chapters focusing specifically on children, women, and Indigenous peoples. We have industry case studies from a range of industries, including mining, food and beverage, ICT, agriculture, the travel and tourism industry, apparel, as well as infrastructure, so a piece on public-private partnerships there. And then we address some of the current challenges and future possibilities. So deep dives into rights holder participation, conflict contexts, how do we measure impacts, how can we use different types of indicators, as well as the role of financial institutions and government actors, and of course thinking through what can human rights impact assessment contribute to the 2030 agenda.
Great, thank you so much, Nora. So with this, I would like to conclude the presentation part, and then allow a little bit of time for some questions and answers. And we took the liberty to already identify some questions that have come up repeatedly, and group them. And so I will read out a few questions, and then I'll give you, the panelists, the floor again. So the first question that came up a couple of times was around gaps in in the performance standards of international finance institutions. So the question is, where are there gaps in performance standards such as the IFC performance standards when it comes to human rights, and how can these be addressed? So any three of you who is willing to answer this question?
Sure, I can have a first go if you like. Indeed, this is a very common question, and it is a very relevant question, I think. I mean, perhaps some of the things that spring to mind for me in answering this question are that this is around different kind of dimensions of the question. So, I mean, the first thing I would probably say is that the biggest issue that we face in terms of the performance standards and human rights is around implementation. Because I think if, the IFC performance standards and other financial institution standards were really implemented properly in projects all the time, and all projects were, to comply with these standards, we would get a very long way to also respecting human rights. So I think the biggest challenge is around implementation rather than necessarily the nitty-gritty of the different types of standards. Having said that, though, there are some discrepancies perhaps in how human rights due diligence is captured in some of these standards. So even though there are often references to the corporate responsibility to respect, for instance, it's rarely an explicit requirement in the standards that companies have to implement human rights due diligence, and that human rights due diligence includes international human rights standards as the benchmark for the assessment. So this is, alluded to, but it's not necessarily a firm requirement in the standards, and indeed that is sometimes acknowledged in the standards through, for example, footnotes that then allude to additional human rights analysis being needed in particularly sensitive contexts or this type of language or framing. And then if you do work through the standards piece by piece against the Universal Declaration and other human rights standards, then you do identify some discrepancies. One of the elements we've talked about on this webinar is, for instance, on gender equality and non-discrimination and women's rights. So here again, women are often mentioned in particular areas, for instance, in relation to land rights, but not necessarily holistically across the standards as a whole. We also have, when we talk about economic and social and cultural rights in human rights, actually a framework for how to analyze whether those rights are indeed met and respected, where we think about the Aaaq criteria, so availability, accessibility, acceptability, and quality, when we're talking about, for instance, education, the right to water and access to sanitation, or the right to housing. And those standards are not necessarily clearly reflected in some of the performance standards. And then there are also some other specific rights that one might argue are very relevant for a lot of the projects that are subject to these performance standards. For instance, the right to privacy, increasingly, especially as we're in the information age, freedom of association and assembly, issues around living wage and security of person, for instance, where you could say that there is insufficient detail in the standards to ensure that human rights are comprehensively met.
Thank you so much for this, Nora. This was very helpful. Another question that came up was what human rights indicators should be used in a human rights impact assessment? Could I give this question to you, Gabby, or to Dirk? Go ahead.
Gabby, go ahead. Since you wrote the chapter in the book on this, I think it's just right that you answer this.
Okay,
You're
no,
muted.
my mute was hard to get. Yeah, so the question is which indicators to use in the human rights. Once again, I got distracted for the microphone. Yeah.
The question is what human rights indicators to use in a human rights impact assessment.
Well, I think that my bigger recommendation was go to the chapter and get the list. I think that is if we're talking about human rights impact assessment, so you will need to refer to the one directly related to the human rights. And some of the things that you may consider when they're choosing the indicators for human rights is that some of them will make more sense to choose the one that are specific to the content and the type of issue, that they are culturally relevant, for example, in case of having indigenous peoples, etc. And some of them it will be more useful to refer directly to the universal ones that will allow you to compare between, for example, different countries or different sectors. So I think that is depending what are you trying to measure. The standards indicators directly related to human rights will be ones, and the one that you will choose that are relevant for the group and the context and the issues that you will look at, they will be relevant. And maybe Dirk, you can complement with the official reference of indicators.
Sure. Well, I mean, there are a number of resources out there that help. The Human Rights Impact Assessment Toolbox that I just showed you also has some information on that. There is a whole platform, open source platform as well, on human rights indicators for business. And the Office of the High Commissioner also has developed human rights indicators that can help. And then Nora, I think it was you who already made a reference to indicators in relation to certain economic, social, and cultural rights when we're talking about, water or health. These the Aaaq indicators or criteria. But there's a lot of information freely available out there.
Thank you, Gabby and Dirk. And just so that you know, the human rights indicators for business are available on the Danish Institute's website and also on the website of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. And in our Human Rights Impact Assessment Guidance and Toolbox, there is also a section dedicated to human rights indicators.
And for those of you who are working in social and health impact assessment, I strongly recommend you to look at the resources on the AAQ, the availability, accessibility, and quality, and how you can integrate that in the baselines and in the indicator for monitoring quality as well.
Thank you, Gabby. And another question that came in, which is very timely in the current pandemic that we're facing, is around what are the things to consider when it comes to human rights impact assessment during the current pandemic. So I would be happy to start myself on this question, and others feel free to add. So one of the questions that has come up is it actually possible to conduct a human rights impact assessment during the pandemic where travels and engaging with people up close is possible? So there has been an ongoing debate. Different organizations and companies and assessors are exploring models to see if they can continue impact assessment. But it's very important to consider the risks if doing, for example, virtual interviews with rights holders, which is one of the opportunities that some organizations are seeking. For example, thinking of when you interview workers, are you actually speaking to the worker that you have identified? Aren't there managers around? Is there privacy being safeguarded? Is the data that you collect not open for others to access if you do this through an online tool like Zoom or something like that? Another thing to consider is the impacts of COVID on different groups. So what are we seeing now more, and what do we have to consider in the human rights impact assessment? We're seeing a lot of pressure on workers. We're seeing cancellations of orders. We're seeing delayed payments of companies to their suppliers. So these are all issues that show that sometimes business models are flawed, like Nora mentioned earlier, and that these should be examined. And important to think also in the context of the pandemic, how can we continue impact assessments as it is important to continue to look at human rights, and what can we use as a methodology? So one of the things that people have been talking about is working more with local organizations and local experts on the ground rather than relying on international impact assessment practitioners and experts. How can we build the capacity and rely on the local expertise and knowledge and skills of people that are already close to the rights holders to still be able to conduct human rights impact assessments? I don't know if any of you have something else to add to this.
I think that one comment is that on the question of integration versus standalone, and some of the questions were also asking for which are good examples. I think that health impact assessment has a lot to, the community of practice of health impact assessment has a lot to tell us, and we can learn a lot about the integration of human rights into other disciplines, for example, health. And I think that the work that is being done at the moment in the pandemic is a very good example of looking at the duty bearers, at the governability and the selection of impacts and how to do a monitoring in a safe way. And addressing the different levels of vulnerability and the different groups and the different impacts of each of the groups in a more holistic way, and with a level of disaggregation that we need in order to assess these things. So I think that it's a call for talking, I think, more with our experts in indigenous peoples that have been affected in a completely different way, and they're requiring completely different measures of protecting the community and how to engage with them in case of the pandemic. And I think that will be a really good idea to talk to with all different specialities, how they have done it, what works, and what have been the challenges and things that not to do in the future. Because I'm afraid that we still continue for a while to do it. So I think that it would be really good to have a dialogue with the different groups of specialties. How have they done it, and what it works.
Thanks, Gabby. This is very useful, and some follow-up action from my own side. So I want to now turn to Tanya and see if there is one or two last questions that we can take before wrapping up.
Absolutely. I think let's do one. And the question that I'm going to throw is, how is the risk of retaliation towards community members who share concerns included in the process of HRIA?
Who wants to kick this off?
I can give it a go. I mean, it's a very important risk to have on your radar, not just in relation to communities, but also, of course, other rights holders that are being consulted, whether it's workers or so one of the ways that I've seen it addressed, or that we've addressed it, is through creating a remedy mechanism that is being handed out to people that you speak to. That can be, depending on the local context, of course, and a phone number. It can be an email or another way of getting into contact with the assessment team to eventually to be able to report if any retaliation is happening.
And maybe to add to that, whenever we conduct human rights impact assessments and we engage with rights holders, we make sure that the company that commissions the impact assessment is not present when we speak to rights holders. So we make sure that the engagement with rights holders is done in a way that they feel safe. We try to identify location where they feel comfortable, and that can help to mitigate those risks.
Yeah. And the other two things that we'll add is the total anonymity when you're reporting back, and make sure that who's selling what cannot be identified. And in many impact assessments, we have recommended, for example, not to engage with certain groups of peoples and just get information through NGOs, organizations working in the area, or who knows the thing, but not to expose it. And in other circumstances, we have requested, for example, to make sure that part of the budget and organization of the consultations is related to safety and security to the people, so they can attend at all. And in some of the cases, for example, not in human rights impact assessment, but normal social impact assessment, is to make sure that the wife don't get consequences of saying something against or different like the husbands of the men in the community. So even at that level, in the way that you make the voting or you do the consultation, that instead of doing publicly, at least one-to-one, or you visit at home, instead of making clear that they are the ones providing the information.
Thank you, Gabby. So with this, I would like to conclude the webinar and give the last word to Tanya for a wrap-up.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so very much for your time and your willingness to participate in this amazing discussion. There's been lots and lots of comments coming through the thread of thank you. This has been very fantastic, very helpful, very thorough. So much appreciation to each of you on the panel for your wisdom. To those of you who are here as participants, thank you for your time as well. We are a rich body of practitioners here at IAIA, and are always looking to expand our membership. So if you're a person who is not a member, we would love to have you join us. You can definitely get information regarding that at the IAIA website. Also, if you'd like to continue this discussion, feel free to do so on social media using the handles at IAIA Network or hashtag IAIA Webinar. Finally, please take a brief moment as we close out this webinar this afternoon, it's evening, this morning, whatever time it is for you, to fill out a very brief survey. There's lots of multiple choice questions, and it's very simple, but the materials that we receive from it, the data we receive, is very, very helpful. So we appreciate your time in that regard as well. Have a wonderful day, and we will see you in the future webinars to come. Have a good one. Bye-bye.